The bone-jarring sound of gunfire echoed down Main Street as Forrest Keller ducked behind a water trough, wondering how a simple cattle drive had landed him in the middle of a shootout in Willow Creek. The year was 1872, and the West was still as wild as the mustangs that roamed the plains beyond the small Montana town. Forrest had been alone for as long as he could remember. At 32, his weathered face and calloused hands told the story of a man who'd spent more time with horses and cattle than with people. His parents had died of fever when he was just 16, leaving him to fend for himself on the unforgiving frontier. The cattle drive from Texas had been successful, but now, with his earnings in his pocket and his faithful horse, Samson, tied up outside the saloon, he found himself caught in someone else's quarrel. The shooting stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Forrest cautiously peered over the edge of the trough, his hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. The street was clearing, townsfolk emerging from wherever they'd taken shelter during the gunfight. That's when he saw her. A woman in a fine blue dress was attempting to cross the street, clutching what appeared to be a doctor's bag. She moved with purpose, seemingly unbothered by the chaos that had just unfolded. But as she stepped off the boardwalk, her ankle twisted on a loose stone. Forrest watched her fall, her medical supplies scattering across the dusty street. Without thinking, he sprinted toward her, his spurs jingling with each step. He reached her just as she was trying to gather her dignity along with her belongings. "Madam, are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gruff from disuse. He extended a hand to her, noticing the way her honey-colored hair had come loose from its pins, framing a face that made his breath catch. "I'm quite all right, thank you," she replied, though her grimace as she tried to put weight on her foot told a different story. "Begging your pardon, but I don't believe you are." Before she could protest, Forrest gently lifted her into his arms. "Name's Forrest Keller, I'll get you to the doctor." "I am the doctor," she said, a hint of defiance in her voice despite her vulnerable position. "Dr. Elizabeth Walsh, and I'd appreciate you setting me down immediately." Forrest felt his eyebrows rise in surprise, but he didn't loosen his hold. "A lady doctor? Well, that's something new. But seeing as you're the one who's hurt, I reckon you'll need to direct me to whoever helps the doctor when she's the one needing help." For a moment, Elizabeth looked like she might argue, but then she sighed. "My office is just down the street, the white building with the green shutters." As Forrest carried her, he couldn't help but notice how perfectly she fit in his arms, as if she belonged there. It was a dangerous thought for a man who'd spent his life avoiding attachments. "You're new in town," Elizabeth observed, her blue eyes studying his face. "Just passing through," Forrest replied. "Delivered a herd from Texas, plan to leave tomorrow." "Well, Mr. Keller, it seems your plans may need to change. I suspect I'll need assistance for a few days, at least until my ankle heals." Forrest looked down at her, surprised by her forthright manner. "Are you offering me a job, Dr. Walsh?" A small smile played at her lips. "Consider it payment for your gallantry, unless you have more pressing engagements elsewhere." He didn't. There was nothing waiting for him anywhere. "No home, no family, just the long, lonely trail. I suppose I could stay on a while," he heard himself say, "if you're in need of help." "Then it's settled," she said, as if hiring strange cowboys off the street was something she did every day. "You may call me Elizabeth. And I shall call you my own personal cavalry." Forrest didn't know it then, but those words, "my own," would echo in his mind for days to come. He had picked her up from the dust of Willow Creek's Main Street, not knowing that in doing so, he was picking up the pieces of his solitary life and rearranging them into something new. Elizabeth's office was neat and organized, smelling of carbolic acid and herbs. Forrest set her down carefully on a wooden examination table as she directed. "There are bandages in that cabinet," she instructed, pointing to a glass-fronted case on the wall, "and I'll need you to fetch me some cold water from the pump out back." Forrest did as he was told, bringing her the supplies and then standing awkwardly as she expertly wrapped her own ankle, explaining that it was merely a sprain and would heal within a week or two. "You have a place to stay?" she asked, once her ankle was tended to. "Was planning on the hotel," Forrest replied. Elizabeth shook her head. Nonsense, I have a spare room above the office. You'll stay there. I'll need help getting around, and having you nearby will be convenient. Forrest wanted to refuse. Getting involved, even in a business arrangement, went against his nature, but something about Elizabeth Walsh made him nod in agreement. I'll fetch my things from the livery, he said, and your horse, Samson, can stay there. I'll pay for his board. Elizabeth nodded. Be back before dark. I'll need help preparing supper. As Forrest walked to the livery stable, he wondered what he'd gotten himself into. A week or two in one place was more than he'd stayed anywhere in years. And living under the same roof as a woman, a beautiful, intelligent woman at that, was bound to complicate things. But as he collected his meager belongings from his saddlebags, he couldn't deny the strange warmth that had settled in his chest. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Forrest Keller wasn't alone. And part of him, a part he'd tried to silence for years, was glad of it. The spare room above Elizabeth's office was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the town's main street. Forrest set his saddlebags on the bed and took off his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. He'd need a bath and a shave if he was going to be presentable, especially around a lady like Elizabeth. After washing up as best he could, Forrest made his way downstairs to find Elizabeth seated at a small kitchen table behind the office, attempting to peel potatoes while keeping her injured foot elevated on a stool. This isn't working very well, she admitted as he entered. I'm afraid I'm not used to being the patient. Let me, Forrest said, taking the knife and potato from her hands. Their fingers brushed, and he felt a jolt of something he couldn't name. Are you handy in a kitchen, Mr. Keller? Elizabeth asked, watching as he expertly peeled the potato in one continuous spiral. Forrest, he corrected. And yes, madam, a man who spends most of his time on cattle drives learns to cook or goes hungry. Well, Forrest, it seems I've lucked into more than just a strong back, Elizabeth said with a smile that reached her eyes. Though I must say I appreciate that as well, I'm not sure how I would have managed to get home on my own. As they prepared the simple meal together, potatoes, salt pork, and biscuits, Forrest found himself talking more than he had in months. Elizabeth asked questions about his life on the trail, and he found himself telling her about the stars over the prairie, the way a herd of cattle sounded as they settled for the night, and the camaraderie of the cowboys he'd ridden with. It sounds lonely, Elizabeth observed as they sat down to eat. Forrest paused, fork halfway to his mouth. I suppose it is. Never thought about it much. And your family, are they back in Texas? He set his fork down, the familiar ache of loss dulled by time but never completely gone. No family. Parents died of fever when I was 16. No siblings. Elizabeth's expression softened. I'm sorry. I lost my parents too, though I was older. My father was a doctor in Boston. He taught me everything he knew, though many believed a woman had no place in medicine. Is that why you came west? Forrest asked. Elizabeth nodded. Partly. After my father died, there was little place for me in Boston society. A spinster lady doctor was not exactly welcome in polite circles. She smiled wryly. Out here, people care more about whether you can set a bone or deliver a baby than about your gender. How long have you been in Willow Creek? 3 years. I came with my fiancé, Richard. He was going to open a law practice. Her voice faltered slightly. He died of typhoid 6 months after we arrived. I decided to stay on. The town needed a doctor, and I needed a purpose. Forrest felt a surge of sympathy. I'm sorry for your loss. Elizabeth met his eyes. Thank you. It was a long time ago now, and I've built a good life here. The people of Willow Creek have accepted me for the most part. As they continued their meal, Forrest found himself watching Elizabeth, the graceful way she moved despite her injury, the intelligence in her eyes, the strength that seemed to radiate from her. She was unlike any woman he'd ever known. After dinner, as Forrest washed the dishes while Elizabeth dried them, he asked, What caused that shooting today? Town seemed peaceful enough when I rode in. Elizabeth sighed. Land dispute. The Webster family and the Dawsons have been feuding over water rights to the creek that runs between their properties. It's been getting worse lately. She set down a plate with more force than necessary. Foolishness, all of it. There's enough water for everyone if they'd just work together. Feuds like that rarely end well, Forrest observed. No, they don't, and I'm the one who has to patch up the wounded. She shook her head. I've tried talking sense to both sides, but neither will listen. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they finished the dishes. Forrest found himself laughing at Elizabeth's stories about some of her more unusual patients, like old Mr. Peterson, who was convinced his rheumatism was caused by his wife's cooking, or young Billy Stevens, who'd gotten a bean stuck up his nose on a dare. As the evening wore on, Forrest helped Elizabeth to her quarters behind the office, a small but comfortable apartment with a sitting room, bedroom, and private bath. He lit the lamps for her and made sure she had everything she needed before bidding her good night. "Thank you, Forrest," she said as he turned to leave. "Not just for the help, but for the company. It's been a while since I've had someone to talk to over dinner." Forrest nodded, suddenly aware of how close they were standing in the doorway of her apartment. "My pleasure, Elizabeth. I'll see you in the morning." As he climbed the stairs to his room, Forrest tried to ignore the unfamiliar feeling blooming in his chest. He'd come to Willow Creek expecting nothing more than a place to rest before moving on. Instead, he'd found… what? He wasn't sure, but for the first time in years, he wasn't in a hurry to leave. The next morning, Forrest woke at dawn, his usual habit from years on the trail. He dressed quietly and made his way downstairs, careful not to disturb Elizabeth. He stoked the fire in the kitchen stove and put on a pot of coffee, then stepped outside to check on Samson. The town was just beginning to stir, shopkeepers opening their doors, the blacksmith already at work, the ring of his hammer carrying down the street. Forrest breathed in the cool morning air, feeling strangely at peace. At the livery, he found Samson well cared for, munching contentedly on hay. The big bay horse nickered in greeting as Forrest approached. "Morning, old friend," Forrest said, stroking the horse's neck. "Looks like we'll be staying put for a spell." After checking Samson's hooves and brushing him down, Forrest headed back to Elizabeth's office. He was surprised to find her already up, hobbling around the kitchen on a makeshift crutch she'd fashioned from a broom. "You shouldn't be up," he said, hurrying to her side. Elizabeth gave him a look that suggested she wasn't used to being told what to do. "I have patients to see. Mrs. Thornton is bringing her baby in this morning for a checkup, and Mr. Daniels needs his stitches removed." "And you can do all that sitting down," Forrest insisted, pulling out a chair for her. "Where's your appointment book? I'll get things ready." For a moment, it looked like Elizabeth might argue, but then she sighed and lowered herself into the chair. "On my desk in the office." "But really, Forrest, I can manage." "Never said you couldn't," he replied, heading for the office. "Just that you don't have to." The appointment book was right where she said it would be, neatly listing the day's patients and their ailments. Forrest returned to find Elizabeth sipping the coffee he'd made. "This is good," she said, sounding surprised. "Better than mine. Like I said, a man learns or goes hungry." He set the appointment book on the table. "Now, what do you need me to do to get ready for Mrs. Thornton and her baby?" For the next hour, Forrest followed Elizabeth's instructions, setting out clean linens, sterilizing instruments, and arranging the examination room. By the time Mrs. Thornton arrived with her infant son, everything was in order. Forrest expected to be dismissed, but Elizabeth asked him to stay. "Mrs. Thornton, this is Mr. Keller. He's assisting me while my ankle heals." The young mother nodded politely, though she looked a bit uncertain about a cowboy being present for her baby's examination. But as Elizabeth began to check the infant, asking Forrest to hand her various instruments and take notes, Mrs. Thornton relaxed. "The baby's thriving," Elizabeth declared after a thorough examination. "You're doing an excellent job, Mrs. Thornton." The young mother beamed with pride. "Thank you, doctor. He's sleeping through the night now, just like you said he would." After Mrs. Thornton left, there was a steady stream of patients. Forrest found himself falling into a rhythm with Elizabeth, anticipating what she needed and learning quickly. He was surprised by how much he enjoyed the work, the sense of purpose, the gratitude of the patients, and most of all, the way Elizabeth's eyes lit up when she was helping someone. Between patients, they talked. Elizabeth told him about her medical training, how her father had taught her despite society's disapproval, and how she'd had to fight for every opportunity. Forrest shared stories of his travels, the different territories he'd seen, the people he'd met along the way. "You've seen so much of the country," Elizabeth said as they ate a quick lunch between appointments. "Don't you ever want to settle somewhere?" Forrest considered the question. "Never found a place that felt like home," he admitted, "or a reason to stay." Elizabeth's eyes met his, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Then she looked away, reaching for her water glass. "Well, Willow Creek isn't much, but it's home to me now. Sometimes home is where you make it, not where you're from." The afternoon brought more patients, including Mr. Daniels with his stitches and an elderly woman with a persistent cough that worried Elizabeth. She prescribed a tonic and asked Forrest to deliver it to the woman's home later, as she lived on the outskirts of town. By the time the last patient left, the sun was beginning to set. Elizabeth looked tired but satisfied as she made notes in her patient records. "You're good at this," Forrest said, cleaning instruments as she'd shown him. "The medicine?" Elizabeth asked, not looking up from her writing. "That too, but I meant caring for people, making them feel better just by being there." Elizabeth paused, pen hovering over the page. "Thank you, that's a kind thing to say." She closed the record book and looked up at him. "You were good today too, a natural actually." "Have you ever considered learning medicine?" Forrest chuckled. "Can't say that I have. Never stayed in one place long enough to learn much of anything beyond cattle and horses." "Well, you have a good hand with people. They trusted you, even Mrs. Thornton, who's usually nervous around strangers." "Reckon they were just being polite to the doctor's helper." Elizabeth shook her head. "No, it's more than that. You have a steadiness about you, Forrest. It's comforting." Their eyes met again, and this time neither looked away. Forrest felt something shift between them, a connection forming that both thrilled and terrified him. The moment was broken by a knock at the door. Forrest cleared his throat and went to answer it, finding a young boy of about 10 standing on the porch, Doc Walsh. The boy called out, trying to peer around Forrest. "Ma says you gotta come quick. Pa's been hurt bad." Elizabeth was already on her feet, reaching for her medical bag. "What happened, Tommy?" He was fixing the roof and fell off. "Ma says his leg's all twisted funny and he can't move it." Forrest put a hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. "You can't go, not with your ankle." "I have to," she insisted. "The Millers live 3 miles out of town by the time someone else got there." "I'll take you," Forrest decided. "Can you ride?" "Yes, but no buts." "I'll saddle Samson and be back in 5 minutes. Get what you need." Without waiting for an argument, Forrest headed for the livery at her run. True to his word, he returned quickly with Samson saddled and ready. "Tommy, you run home and tell your ma we're coming," Elizabeth instructed the boy, who nodded and took off down the street. Forrest helped Elizabeth onto Samson, then mounted behind her, one arm securely around her waist as they set off at a trot. The feel of her pressed against him, the scent of her hair lavender and something uniquely her filled his senses. He pushed the thoughts away, focusing on the urgent matter at hand. The Miller farm was a small homestead nestled against the foothills. As they approached, Mrs. Miller ran out to meet them, her face streaked with tears. "Oh, Dr. Walsh, thank God you've come. He's in a bad way." Forrest helped Elizabeth down and supported her as they hurried into the house. Mr. Miller was lying on the kitchen table, his face gray with pain, his right leg bent at an unnatural angle. "Broken femur," Elizabeth muttered to Forrest as she examined the injury. "We'll need to set it. Mrs. Miller, I need clean cloths, hot water, and your strongest whiskey." For the next hour, Forrest assisted as Elizabeth worked to set the broken bone. She showed him how to hold Mr. Miller still, how to help prepare a splint, and how to bandage the leg once the bone was back in place. The farmer passed out from the pain during the procedure, which Elizabeth said was a blessing. "He'll need to stay off it for at least 8 weeks, she told Mrs. Miller when they'd finished. "I'll come check on him in a few days. In the meantime, keep him resting and make sure he drinks plenty of water." It was dark by the time they left the Miller farm. The night was clear, stars spreading across the sky in a dazzling display. Forrest helped Elizabeth onto Samson again, then mounted behind her. "Are you all right?" he asked as they started back toward town. That couldn't have been easy on your ankle. I'm fine, Elizabeth said, though he could hear the fatigue in her voice. Thank you for bringing me. I couldn't have done it without you. Forrest tightened his arm around her waist slightly. You did all the hard work, I just held things. You did more than that. You kept Mrs. Miller calm, you helped me lift him when I needed to examine his back, and you knew exactly what I needed before I asked for it. Forrest didn't know what to say to that, so he remained silent. They rode through the darkness, the only sounds the steady rhythm of Samson's hooves and the night creatures calling to one another. It's beautiful out here, Elizabeth said after a while. I never get tired of these stars. In Boston, you could hardly see them with all the city lights and the smoke from the factories. Out on the trail, sometimes it feels like you could reach up and touch them, Forrest replied. Used to fall asleep counting them when I was younger. Did you ever make wishes on them? Forrest chuckled. Sometimes, never seemed to come true, though. What did you wish for? Elizabeth asked, her voice soft in the darkness. He hesitated, then answered honestly. A home, a place to belong. Elizabeth leaned back slightly against his chest. And now. Forrest paused, suddenly aware of how right it felt to have her in his arms, riding under the vast canopy of stars. Now I'm not sure what to wish for. They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence. By the time they reached town, Elizabeth was leaning heavily against him, nearly asleep with exhaustion. Forrest dismounted first, then gently lifted her down from the saddle. I can walk, she protested weakly. I know you can, he said, but you don't have to. Without further argument, he lifted her into his arms, carrying her just as he had the day before when he'd found her fallen in the street. Only this time it felt different. This time, he knew her strength, her compassion, her determination. This time, when he called her his own in the privacy of his thoughts, it meant something entirely different. Back at her office, Forrest carried Elizabeth straight to her apartment and set her down carefully on her sofa. He lit the lamps and built up the fire, then asked if she needed anything. Just rest, she said, her eyes already closing. And maybe some tea. Forrest prepared the tea and brought it to her, along with some bread and cheese he found in the kitchen. He sat with her while she ate, making sure she took some willow bark powder for the pain in her ankle. You should get some sleep, he said when she'd finished. It's been a long day. Elizabeth nodded but made no move to get up. Forrest, she said, her voice quiet, why have you never settled anywhere? Really? The question caught him off guard. He looked into the fire, gathering his thoughts. After my parents died, there wasn't much to keep me in one place. Got used to moving around, I suppose. Easier that way. Easier how? He met her eyes. Easier not to get attached, not to care too much. Elizabeth's gaze was steady. And is that working for you, not caring? Forrest felt something shift inside him, like a door long closed beginning to open. Used to. The word hung between them, full of meaning. Elizabeth reached out and placed her hand over his. Thank you for today, for everything. He turned his hand over, letting their palms meet, fingers intertwining. Thank you for letting me help. They sat like that for a long moment, hands joined, the fire crackling softly in the grate. Then Elizabeth yawned, breaking the spell. I should let you get to bed, Forrest said, reluctantly releasing her hand and standing. Yes, I suppose you should. Elizabeth's eyes held his for a beat longer than necessary. Good night, Forrest. Good night, Elizabeth. As he climbed the stairs to his room, Forrest tried to make sense of the feelings swirling inside him. He'd known Elizabeth Walsh for barely 2 days, yet already she'd worked her way under his skin, making him question the solitary life he'd built for himself. It was dangerous, these feelings. Dangerous and unexpected. But as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Forrest couldn't bring himself to regret them. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was looking forward to tomorrow. The next few days fell into a pattern. Forrest would wake early, check on Samson, prepare breakfast, and help Elizabeth with her patients. In the afternoons, when there was a lull in appointments, he would run errands for her, delivering medicines to those too ill to come to the office or picking up supplies from the general store. Elizabeth's ankle was improving, but she still needed help with the more physical aspects of her practice. Forrest found himself learning more about medicine than he'd ever thought possible. He learned how to clean and dress wounds, how to recognize different ailments, and even how to prepare some of Elizabeth's simpler remedies. More than that, he was learning about Elizabeth herself, her quick mind, her dry wit, her unwavering commitment to her patients. He learned that she hummed softly when she was concentrating, that she took her tea with honey but never sugar, that she kept a journal where she wrote her observations about difficult cases. And she was learning about him too. She discovered his talent for whittling when she found him carving a small wooden horse for one of her younger patients. She learned that he could recite poetry from memory, a skill taught to him by his mother before she died. She found out that despite his rough exterior, he was gentle with children and animals, patient with the elderly, and respectful to everyone he met. 5 days after Forrest had first carried Elizabeth from the street, they were sitting in her kitchen after the day's patients had gone. Elizabeth was showing him how to prepare a tincture for treating coughs when there was a commotion outside, shouting and the sound of horses galloping down the main street. Forrest went to the window. "Looks like trouble," he said, watching as several men rode past, guns drawn. "The Webster-Dawson feud again," Elizabeth sighed, setting down the bottle she was holding. "Probably it's been brewing for days." Before they could discuss it further, there was a pounding at the door. Forrest opened it to find a young man, barely out of his teens, supporting an older man who was bleeding profusely from a gunshot wound to the shoulder. "Doc Walsh," the young man cried. "Pa's been shot." Forrest recognized them as the Websters, father and son. He helped them inside as Elizabeth cleared the examination table. "What happened?" she asked, already cutting away the elder Webster's shirt to expose the wound. "Damn Dawsons," Webster's son spat. "Ambushed Pa on our own land." Elizabeth shot Forrest a look that clearly said this wasn't the time for feuding talk. "Forrest, I need hot water, carbolic acid, and my surgical kit." For the next hour they worked to remove the bullet and clean the wound. The bullet had missed any vital areas, but Webster had lost a lot of blood. Once he was stabilized, Elizabeth gave instructions for his care and had Forrest help the son get his father into their wagon to take him home. "This has to stop," Elizabeth said as they watched the Websters drive away. "Someone's going to get killed," Forrest nodded grimly. "Already almost did." They were cleaning up when the door burst open again. This time it was Sheriff Hollister, a stocky man with a graying mustache and tired eyes. "Doc Walsh," he said, removing his hat. "Heard Webster got shot. How bad?" "He'll live," Elizabeth replied, "but only by luck. The bullet missed anything vital." The sheriff nodded. "Well, that's something, but I got 3 Dawsons in my jail and James Webster and his boys are threatening to break them out and hang them. Town's on edge. Doc, can't you do something?" Elizabeth asked. "Talk to them, reason with them," Sheriff Hollister sighed. "Been trying for months. Neither side will listen. Water rights, property lines, hell, at this point I think they've forgotten what started it all. They just know they hate each other." "There has to be a solution," Elizabeth insisted. "This can't go on." The sheriff looked at her sadly. "If you figure one out, I'm all ears. In the meantime, I'd stay inside tonight if I were you. Things might get ugly." After the sheriff left, Elizabeth paced the kitchen, her limp barely noticeable now. "This is madness, all over a creek that has plenty of water for everyone." Forrest watched her, admiring her passion even as he worried about her getting involved in something dangerous. "People get set in their ways. Pride makes it hard to back down." "Pride?" Elizabeth stopped pacing and turned to him. "People are getting shot over pride. Not saying it's right," Forrest clarified. "Just saying that's how it is." Elizabeth shook her head. "Well, it shouldn't be. There has to be a way to make them see reason." "Elizabeth," Forrest said gently, "this isn't your fight, isn't it? When I'm the one patching up bullet holes and setting broken bones, when children are going hungry because their fathers are too busy feuding to tend their farms properly." Her blue eyes flashed with determination. "Someone has to do something, and it seems no one else will." Forrest recognized the look on her face. It was the same one she wore when faced with a difficult medical case, determined, focused, unwilling to give up. It was one of the things he admired most about her, even as it worried him now. "What are you thinking?" he asked cautiously. "I'm thinking we need to get both families in the same room, make them talk to each other." And how do you propose to do that? The sheriff already said neither side will listen. Elizabeth's expression turned thoughtful. They'll listen to me. They have to. I'm the only doctor for 20 miles. Both families need me. She looked at Forrest. And they'll listen to you. Me, Forrest shook his head. I'm just a passing cowboy. Why would they listen to me? Because you're neutral. You have no stake in their feud. And she hesitated. You have a way about you, Forrest. People trust you. I've seen it with my patients. Forrest wasn't convinced, but the determination in Elizabeth's eyes told him she wouldn't be dissuaded. What's your plan? Tomorrow, I'll send messages to both families. I'll tell them I need to speak with them about a medical matter that concerns them both. I'll ask them to come here, but at different times, the Websters at noon, the Dawsons at 12:30. So they'll overlap, Forrest said, understanding dawning. You're going to trap them here together. Elizabeth nodded. Exactly, and once they're here, we'll make them listen to reason. And if they don't, if they just start shooting at each other in your office, that's where you come in, Elizabeth said, a small smile playing at her lips. You'll disarm them at the door. Forrest raised his eyebrows. Just like that, just like that. Elizabeth's confidence was unwavering. Will you help me, Forrest, please? Looking into her earnest blue eyes, Forrest knew he couldn't refuse her anything. All right, he agreed, but I hope you know what you're doing. Elizabeth's smile widened. I do, trust me, and the strange thing was he did trust her. More than he'd trusted anyone in a very long time. That night, as Forrest lay in bed, he thought about the plan and all the ways it could go wrong. The Websters and Dawsons had been feuding for years, according to what he'd heard around town. Getting them to listen to reason wouldn't be easy, especially not when they were forced into the same room together. But he also thought about Elizabeth, her determination, her compassion, her unwavering belief that people could be better than they were. In the week he'd known her, she'd begun to change something in him, awakening feelings he'd thought long buried. Hope, connection, the desire for something more than the solitary life he'd been living. Whatever happened tomorrow, Forrest knew one thing for certain. He was no longer just passing through Willow Creek. For better or worse, his fate was now tied to Elizabeth Walsh's, and he wouldn't have it any other way. The next morning, Forrest woke with the sun, his mind already turning over the day ahead. He dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Elizabeth already up, writing the messages she planned to send to the feuding families. Did you sleep? He asked, noting the shadows under her eyes. A little, she admitted, setting down her pen. I was thinking about what to say to them. And I think we need to appeal to their self-interest, show them how the feud is hurting their own families, not just their enemies. Forrest nodded, impressed by her insight. That might work. People who won't do the right thing for others' sake might do it for their own. Elizabeth smiled at him. Exactly. Now, would you mind taking these messages? I don't trust anyone else to deliver them without raising suspicions. Forrest agreed, and after a quick breakfast, he saddled Samson and rode out to the Webster and Dawson farms. Both properties bordered the creek that was the source of their dispute, on opposite sides. As he rode, Forrest could see that both farms were suffering from neglect, fences in need of repair, fields only partially planted, livestock looking thin. At the Webster farm, he was met with suspicion, but when he explained he came from Dr. Walsh with an urgent medical matter, they accepted the message. The Dawsons were similarly wary but equally willing to come when they heard it concerned their health. By the time Forrest returned to town, it was mid-morning. Elizabeth had cleared her schedule of regular patients and was preparing the office for the meeting. They're coming, Forrest told her, both families, though they weren't happy about it. They'll be even less happy when they find out they're meeting each other, Elizabeth said, arranging chairs in a circle in the waiting room. But sometimes medicine requires bitter treatment. As noon approached, Forrest positioned himself near the door, ready to collect weapons from the arriving families. Elizabeth sat at her desk, outwardly calm but with tension evident in the set of her shoulders. The Websters arrived first. James Webster, his shoulder bandaged from the previous day's gunshot wound, accompanied by his 2 sons and his brother. They handed over their guns reluctantly when Forrest explained it was the doctor's policy, no exceptions. "What's this about, Doc?" Webster asked as they seated themselves. "Your note said it was urgent." "It is," Elizabeth assured him, "but I need to wait for the others before I explain." "Others?" Webster's eyes narrowed. "What others?" Before Elizabeth could answer, the door opened again, and in walked Thomas Dawson, the patriarch of the Dawson clan, along with his 3 sons and his cousin. They stopped short when they saw the Websters, hands immediately going to where their guns would have been. "What is this?" Dawson demanded, his face reddening. "A trap, please, Mr. Dawson," Elizabeth said, standing and motioning to the empty chairs. "This is a medical consultation. I need to speak with both families about a matter that concerns you all." "I ain't sitting down with no Websters," Dawson spat. "Come on, boys, we're leaving." Forrest moved to block the door. "Gentlemen, Dr. Walsh has something important to say. I suggest you hear her out before you go." There was a tense moment when it seemed the Dawsons might try to force their way past. But something in Forrest's steady gaze, or perhaps the fact that he was a head taller than any of them, and clearly no stranger to fighting, made them reconsider. 5 minutes, Dawson growled. "Then we're gone." The Dawsons took seats as far from the Websters as possible. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Elizabeth took a deep breath and began. "Gentlemen, I've asked you here because I'm concerned about a condition affecting both your families. It's a condition that's causing malnutrition in your children, undue stress on your wives, and physical injuries to yourselves." The men exchanged confused glances. "What condition is that, Doc?" James Webster asked warily. "Feud fever," Elizabeth said simply. "It's consuming your lives, your livelihoods, and potentially your futures." There was a moment of stunned silence, followed by angry muttering from both sides. "This ain't a medical matter," Thomas Dawson said, starting to rise. "This is a waste of time. Sit down, mister." "Dawson," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying an authority that belied her small stature. Surprisingly, Dawson obeyed. "As the doctor for this community, I consider anything that threatens the health and well-being of my patients to be a medical matter, and this feud is doing exactly that." She walked to the center of the room, looking each man in the eye as she spoke. "In the past month alone, I've treated 3 broken bones, 1 concussion, and now a gunshot wound, all from confrontations between your families. I've prescribed sleeping drafts for your wives, who lie awake worrying that their husbands won't come home. I've noted weight loss in your children because your farms are producing less food while you're busy fighting." The men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but they were listening. "The creek has enough water for both your properties," Elizabeth continued. "I've consulted with experts on the matter. With proper management, a shared dam, perhaps, or a schedule for usage, there would be more than enough for everyone. But instead, you're all suffering, and for what? Pride." "Stubbornness? It ain't that simple, Doc," James Webster said. "The Dawsons have been stealing our water for years." "Stealing?" Thomas Dawson leapt to his feet. "That creek runs through our land, it's our water." "It runs through both your lands," Forrest interjected from his position by the door. All eyes turned to him. "I rode out there this morning, saw both properties, both struggling, both in need. Seems to me you're hurting yourselves more than you're hurting each other." There was silence as the men considered his words. Then one of the younger Dawsons spoke up. "Pa, he's right. We barely got half our fields planted this spring cause we were too busy watching for Websters. And our fences are falling down," added one of the Webster boys. "Lost 3 calves last week cause we didn't have time to mend them properly." Elizabeth seized on the moment. "Gentlemen, I'm proposing a truce, not for each other's sake, but for your own families, for your wives who are worried sick, for your children who need their fathers whole and present." The room was quiet as the men looked at each other, years of hostility warring with the simple truth of Elizabeth's words. "What are you suggesting, Doc?" Thomas Dawson asked finally, his voice gruff but no longer angry. "A meeting. A real one with the sheriff present. To discuss a fair way to share the water, to put an end to this before someone gets killed." Elizabeth looked from one family to the other. "Will you do it? Not for each other, but for yourselves?" James Webster and Thomas Dawson stared at each other for a long moment. Then Webster spoke. My youngest boy, he asked me yesterday why we hate the Dawsons. He shook his head slowly. And you know what? I couldn't rightly remember how it all started. Dawson gave a short, surprised laugh. Reckon I couldn't either if my grandkids asked. So, is that a yes? Elizabeth pressed. You'll try to work this out. The two patriarchs looked at each other again, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of the futility of their feud. I'll meet, Webster said finally. Me too, Dawson agreed. Can't promise more than that, but I'll hear what you have to say. Elizabeth's face lit up with a smile that made Forrest's heart skip a beat. That's all I'm asking. Sheriff Hollister can mediate tomorrow here at my office, 2 o'clock. The families left separately, the atmosphere tense but no longer hostile. When they were gone, Elizabeth turned to Forrest, her eyes shining. They agreed. I can hardly believe it. Forrest couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. They agreed to talk. That's a start. It's more than that, Elizabeth insisted. It's the beginning of the end of this ridiculous feud. I can feel it. Her joy was infectious, and Forrest found himself caught up in it. Without thinking, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. You're something else, Elizabeth Walsh, he said softly. I've never met anyone like you. Elizabeth's smile softened, and she leaned slightly into his touch. And I've never met anyone like you, Forrest Keller. For a long moment they stood there, the air between them charged with something neither was ready to name. Then Elizabeth stepped back, a flush rising to her cheeks. I should let Sheriff Hollister know about the meeting tomorrow, she said, her voice a little breathless. Forrest nodded, letting his hand drop to his side. I'll go with you, just in case the families have second thoughts and decide to cause trouble. As they walked to the sheriff's office, Forrest was acutely aware of Elizabeth beside him, of the occasional brush of her arm against his, of the way the sunlight caught in her honey-colored hair. He'd been in Willow Creek just over a week, and already he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The thought should have frightened him. For years, he'd avoided attachment, avoided anything that might tie him to one place or one person. But with Elizabeth, the prospect of staying didn't fill him with the usual restlessness. Instead, it felt like coming home. Sheriff Hollister was skeptical when they told him about the planned meeting, but agreed to act as mediator. Don't get your hopes up, Doc, he warned. These families have been at each other's throats for a generation. People can change, Elizabeth insisted. They just need a reason to. As they left the sheriff's office, Forrest caught sight of a poster tacked to the wall, a notice for a town social the following Saturday night. Look at that, he said, nodding toward the poster. Might be nice to do something that isn't patching up feuding neighbors. Elizabeth followed his gaze and smiled. The spring social, I'd almost forgotten with everything that's been happening. She looked up at him, a hint of shyness in her expression. Would you like to go with me? Forrest felt a warmth spread through his chest. I'd like that very much. The next day, the meeting between the Webster and Dawson families went better than anyone expected. With Sheriff Hollister keeping order and Elizabeth and Forrest offering suggestions, the two families agreed to a tentative arrangement for sharing the creek water. They would build a joint irrigation system that would ensure fair distribution to both properties, with costs and labor shared equally. I never thought I'd see the day, Sheriff Hollister said afterward, shaking his head in wonder. You two make quite a team. Elizabeth beamed at the compliment, and Forrest felt a surge of pride. They were a team, he realized. In just over a week, they'd fallen into a partnership that felt as natural as breathing. As the days passed, Forrest continued to help Elizabeth with her practice, learning more about medicine and about her. Her ankle was fully healed now, but neither of them mentioned him leaving. It was as if they'd reached an unspoken agreement that he would stay, at least for now. The night of the town's social arrived, and Forrest found himself more nervous than he'd been before facing down armed feuding families. He'd bought a new shirt at the general store and had actually paid for a proper bath at the barber's, wanting to look his best for Elizabeth. When he came downstairs to her apartment, he found her waiting in the sitting room, dressed in a soft blue gown that matched her eyes, her honey-colored hair arranged in loose curls around her face. She looked so beautiful that for a moment, Forrest couldn't speak. Is something wrong?" Elizabeth asked, a crease of worry appearing between her brows. Forrest shook his head, finding his voice. "No, nothing's wrong. You look beautiful." The worry vanished, replaced by a smile that lit up her entire face. "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself." He offered her his arm, and together they walked to the town hall where the social was being held. The large room was decorated with spring flowers and lit with dozens of lanterns. A small band played in one corner, and couples were already dancing while others gathered around tables laden with food and drink. People greeted Elizabeth warmly as they entered, many of them patients Forrest had met over the past week and a half. There were curious glances at him and more than a few knowing smiles when they saw him and Elizabeth arm in arm. "Dr. Walsh," Mrs. Thornton approached, her baby boy in her arms, "and Mr. Keller, how lovely to see you both." "Mrs. Thornton," Elizabeth greeted her, "how is little James doing?" "Growing like a weed, thanks to your advice." The young mother smiled at them both. "You make a handsome couple, if you don't mind my saying." Forrest felt Elizabeth tense slightly beside him, but her voice was steady when she replied. "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton, though Mr. Keller and I are just friends." The word friends felt inadequate to Forrest, but he understood Elizabeth's hesitation. Whatever was growing between them was still new, still undefined. After Mrs. Thornton moved on, Elizabeth turned to him with an apologetic smile. "People in small towns love to gossip." "I hope that didn't make you uncomfortable." "Not at all," Forrest assured her. "Being seen with the prettiest woman in the room, I'd call that a privilege." Elizabeth's cheeks flushed pink at the compliment. "Would you like to dance?" she asked, changing the subject as the band started a new tune. Forrest hesitated. "I should warn you, I'm not much of a dancer." "Neither am I," Elizabeth admitted with a laugh, "but I'm willing to risk it if you are." And so they danced, a little awkwardly at first, but soon finding their rhythm together. Forrest's hand at her waist, Elizabeth's on his shoulder. They moved around the floor, sometimes stepping on each other's toes and laughing about it. As the night wore on, they danced more, talked with townspeople, and enjoyed the food and punch. Forrest was introduced to so many people he lost track of names, but he was struck by how well-liked Elizabeth was in Willow Creek, and how the town seemed to have accepted him by extension. Near the end of the evening, the band played a slow waltz. Forrest held Elizabeth closer than before, their bodies moving in perfect harmony now that they'd grown accustomed to each other's movements. "I've been thinking," Elizabeth said, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. "About what?" Forrest asked, looking down at her upturned face. "About you, about why you haven't left yet." Forrest's heart beat faster. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," Elizabeth said quickly. "That's not what I meant. I wondered what's keeping you here. Your ankle is healed. You don't need my help anymore." Forrest took a deep breath. It was time for honesty. "I think you know why I'm still here, Elizabeth." She held his gaze, her blue eyes searching his. "I'd like to hear you say it." The music swelled around them as they continued to dance, but for Forrest, the world had narrowed to just the two of them. "I'm here because of you," he said simply. "Because in all my years of wandering, I've never met anyone who made me want to stay in one place. Until now." Elizabeth's lips parted in surprise, though perhaps not at his words, but at his willingness to speak them. "Forrest." "You don't have to say anything," he assured her. "I know it's only been a short time, I know it might seem crazy, but when I picked you up from that street, something changed for me, and every day since then, it's only gotten stronger." The music ended, but they remained standing close together, oblivious to the people around them beginning to leave. "It doesn't seem crazy to me," Elizabeth said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "because I feel it too." Forrest's heart soared at her words. He was about to respond when they were interrupted by Sheriff Hollister. "Doc, Mr. Keller," the sheriff said, tipping his hat to them. "Just wanted to let you know the Websters and Dawsons actually sat at the same table tonight. Didn't say much to each other, but they didn't shoot each other either. Progress, I'd say." Elizabeth smiled, though Forrest could see she was as frustrated by the interruption as he was. "That's wonderful news, Sheriff. Thank you for letting us know." After the sheriff moved on, Forrest looked around and realized the social was ending, people saying their goodbyes and gathering their things. We should probably head back, he suggested reluctantly. Elizabeth nodded, equally hesitant. Yes, I suppose we should. The walk back to Elizabeth's office was quiet, both of them lost in thought after their interrupted moment of honesty. The night was clear and cool, stars twinkling overhead, reminiscent of their ride back from the Miller farm. When they reached her door, Elizabeth turned to face him. Would you like to come in for some tea? Or perhaps something stronger? I'd like that, Forrest replied, following her inside. In her sitting room, Elizabeth poured them each a small glass of whiskey. They sat side by side on the sofa, closer than was strictly proper, but neither seemed to care about propriety at the moment. What happens now? Elizabeth asked after taking a sip of her drink. With us, I mean, Forrest considered the question. That depends on what you want, Elizabeth. What if I want you to stay? Her voice was soft, almost vulnerable. Not just as my assistant or as a friend, but as more. Forrest set his glass down and took hers, placing it beside his on the small table. Then he took her hands in his. Then I'd stay for as long as you wanted me. And if that's forever? Elizabeth's eyes searched his as if looking for any sign of hesitation. Then it's forever, Forrest said simply. Elizabeth's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. I never expected this. When you lifted me up from that street, I never imagined. Neither did I, Forrest admitted, but now I can't imagine anything else. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Forrest leaned in and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, a question more than a demand. Elizabeth answered by winding her arms around his neck and drawing him closer, deepening the kiss with a passion that matched the feelings that had been building between them. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Forrest rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Elizabeth Walsh. I know it's fast, but I do. I love your courage, your compassion, your determination. I love the way you care for people, the way you never give up on them. Elizabeth's eyes shone with unshed tears. And I love you, Forrest Keller. I love your steadiness, your strength, your kindness. I love that you see people for who they are, not who you want them to be. They sat together late into the night, talking about their pasts, their hopes, their dreams for the future. A future that, for the first time, Forrest could clearly see a future with Elizabeth beside him. The following morning, Forrest woke in his small room above Elizabeth's office with a sense of purpose he'd never felt before. He dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Elizabeth already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. Good morning, she said, her smile warming him more than the coffee she handed him. Sleep well. Better than I have in years, Forrest replied honestly, taking the cup and letting his fingers brush against hers. Elizabeth's cheeks flushed slightly at the contact. I was thinking, she said, turning back to the stove, about what we discussed last night. Which part? Forrest asked, moving to stand beside her close enough to catch the lavender scent of her hair, the part about you staying, about us. Elizabeth looked up at him, her expression serious. I meant what I said, Forrest. I want you to stay, but I also want you to be sure. This is a small town and I'm established here, my practice, my patience. You're worried I'll get restless, Forrest guessed, that I'll want to move on. Elizabeth nodded, a shadow of uncertainty crossing her face. You've been a wanderer for so long. I wouldn't want you to feel trapped. Forrest set down his coffee cup and took the wooden spoon from her hand, setting it aside. Then he turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Elizabeth, listen to me. I've spent 15 years running from place to place, never feeling like I belonged anywhere. But here, with you, I've found something I wasn't even sure existed anymore, a home. Not just a place to stay, but a place where I matter, where I can make a difference. He cupped her face in his hands. I'm not going anywhere, not unless you're coming with me. The worry in Elizabeth's eyes gave way to relief, then to something deeper, more intense. In that case, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion shining in her eyes, I have a proposition for you. I'm listening. The practice is growing. I could use a partner, someone to help with the workload, someone who's good with people, who learns quickly, who cares. Elizabeth took a deep breath. I could teach you, Forrest, if you wanted to learn. You have a natural talent for medicine and with training. Forrest stared at her, stunned by the offer. You want me to be your partner, in the practice? Elizabeth nodded. And in life, if you'll have me. The magnitude of what she was offering not just her heart but a future, a purpose left Forrest momentarily speechless. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "To both, always yes." Elizabeth laughed, the sound muffled against his shirt. "You haven't even heard the terms yet." Forrest pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "The terms don't matter, as long as they include you." "Well, they definitely include me," Elizabeth assured him, her eyes twinkling. "In fact, I was thinking we might make it official. If you're going to be my partner in the practice, it would be much more convenient if you were also my husband." Forrest's heart seemed to stop, then restart at double speed. "Elizabeth Walsh, are you proposing to me?" "I believe I am," she replied, a hint of nervousness in her otherwise confident voice. "Is that terribly forward of me?" "It's terribly perfect," Forrest said, breaking into a grin. "And the answer is yes, 1,000 times yes." He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around the small kitchen as she laughed, her hands braced on his shoulders. When he set her down, he kissed her with all the love and promise he felt in his heart. The eggs Elizabeth had been cooking began to smoke, forgotten in the emotion of the moment. They broke apart, laughing as they rushed to save their breakfast. "Maybe I shouldn't be too hasty about making you my medical partner," Elizabeth teased as they scraped the burnt eggs into the trash. "Not if you're going to be a distraction in the kitchen," Forrest laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I promise to be very professional during working hours, Dr. Walsh." "And after working hours?" Elizabeth asked, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Forrest pulled her close again. "After working hours, Mrs. Keller to be, all bets are off." Over the next few weeks, news of their engagement spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Most people weren't surprised. They had seen the way Forrest and Elizabeth looked at each other, the way they worked together so seamlessly. The Websters and Dawsons, continuing their tentative peace, joined forces to build the couple a wedding present, a new examination table for the office, crafted from the finest oak. Mrs. Thornton and the other women of the town organized a quilting bee, creating a beautiful wedding quilt as a gift. Sheriff Hollister offered to give Elizabeth away at the ceremony, since her father was no longer living. Forrest began his medical training in earnest, reading Elizabeth's textbooks in the evenings and assisting her with increasingly complex procedures during the day. He discovered he had an aptitude for setting bones and stitching wounds, his steady hands and calm demeanor perfect for the work. They set the wedding date for the end of summer, wanting a small ceremony in the town church, followed by a celebration in the town square. Elizabeth wrote to her few remaining relatives in Boston, inviting them to attend, though she wasn't sure if they would make the journey. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch of what was now their shared home, Elizabeth having insisted Forrest move from the small room above the office to her apartment, they watched a thunderstorm rolling in from the west. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, lightning flickering in the distance. "Do you ever miss it?" Elizabeth asked, her head resting on Forrest's shoulder. "The open trail, the freedom to go wherever you wanted." Forrest considered the question, watching the storm approach. "Sometimes I miss the stars," he admitted. "The way they look when there's nothing between you and them but open sky." He turned to look at her. "But I wouldn't trade what I have now for all the stars in the heavens." Elizabeth smiled, leaning up to kiss him softly. "Maybe we could take a trip sometime, ride out under those stars together." "I'd like that," Forrest said, "though I've been thinking we might need to invest in a proper wagon first." "A wagon?" Elizabeth looked at him curiously. "What for?" "Well, a horse is fine for one person, maybe two in a pinch, but for a family." Forrest let the implication hang in the air. Elizabeth's eyes widened. "A family?" Forrest nodded, suddenly nervous. They hadn't discussed children yet, not specifically. "If that's something you'd want, someday." The smile that spread across Elizabeth's face was answer enough, but she put it into words anyway. "It's something I've always wanted. A husband, children, a home filled with love." She placed her hand on his cheek. "You've already given me two of those things, the third." "Well, that would make my happiness complete." Forrest turned his head to kiss her palm. "Then that's what we'll do, build a family together." The first fat raindrops began to fall as they sat there, planning their future. They stayed on the porch until the rain became too heavy, then moved inside, continuing their conversation by lamplight late into the night. 2 weeks before their wedding, Elizabeth received a surprise. A stagecoach arrived in Willow Creek carrying her aunt and uncle from Boston, come to attend the ceremony. "Aunt Margaret, Uncle William," Elizabeth cried, embracing the elderly couple as they descended from the coach. "I can't believe you came all this way." "Did you think we'd miss our only niece's wedding?" Aunt Margaret said, patting Elizabeth's cheek affectionately. "Though I must say, when we got your letter about marrying a cowboy, your uncle nearly had an apoplexy." Elizabeth laughed, linking arms with her aunt. "Wait until you meet him. He's not just a cowboy anymore, he's a doctor in training." "Is he now?" Uncle William harumphed, though there was a twinkle in his eye. "Well, I suppose that's something." When they reached the office, Forrest was just finishing with a patient, Mr. Peterson, with his persistent complaints about his wife's cooking and his rheumatism. "Now remember, Mr. Peterson," Forrest was saying as they entered, "the liniment is for your joints, not for Mrs. Peterson's stew." The old man chuckled. "Can't blame a fellow for trying, Doc." He tipped his hat to Elizabeth and her relatives. "Afternoon, Doc Walsh. These your folks from back east." Elizabeth made the introductions, watching with pride as Forrest greeted her aunt and uncle with impeccable manners. Uncle William, despite his initial skepticism, was soon engaged in a deep conversation with Forrest about the latest medical developments they'd read about in journals. "He's quite knowledgeable for a self-taught man," Uncle William commented later when Forrest had gone to check on a patient across town. "He's a quick study," Elizabeth replied, "and he has a natural instinct for healing. He'll make an excellent doctor." Aunt Margaret patted her hand. "And a good husband too, I think. I see the way he looks at you, dear, like you're the sun and moon and stars all rolled into one." Elizabeth blushed but didn't deny it. "I love him, Aunt Margaret, more than I ever thought possible." "Then that's all that matters," her aunt said firmly. "Your parents would have approved, I think, especially your father. He always said a good doctor needs compassion as much as knowledge. Your young man seems to have both." The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the late summer heat tempered by a gentle breeze. The small church was filled to capacity, with many townspeople standing outside, waiting to congratulate the couple afterward. Forrest stood at the altar, dressed in a new suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. He'd never been more nervous or more certain of anything in his life. When the church doors opened and Elizabeth appeared on Sheriff Hollister's arm, Forrest felt his breath catch. She wore a simple white gown with lace at the collar and cuffs, her honey-colored hair arranged with white flowers, her blue eyes shining with love as they met his. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to be partners in all things, to support each other's dreams, to build a life and a family together. "I, Forrest Keller, take you, Elizabeth Walsh, as my wife," Forrest said, his voice steady despite the emotion welling in his chest. "From the moment I lifted you from that street, you have been my own, my heart, my home, my purpose. I promise to love you, to cherish you, to stand beside you through whatever life brings, until my last breath." Elizabeth's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she spoke her vows. "I, Elizabeth Walsh, take you, Forrest Keller, as my husband. When you came into my life, I thought I was complete on my own, but you showed me how much more there could be, how much fuller, richer, and more beautiful life is when it's shared. I promise to love you, to honor you, to walk with you through all our days, as your partner, your friend, and your wife." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Forrest kissed Elizabeth with a tenderness that spoke of all they had found in each other and all they would build together. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. The town square was decorated with lanterns and flowers, tables laden with food contributed by nearly every family in Willow Creek. There was dancing and laughter, toasts and well wishes. Even the Websters and Dawsons attended together, their feud now a thing of the past. They had completed their joint irrigation system, and both farms were flourishing as a result. "You too did that," Sheriff Hollister said, nodding toward the once feuding families now sharing a table. brought peace to this town when nobody thought it was possible. They did it themselves, Elizabeth said modestly. We just gave them a reason to try. As the night grew late, Forrest and Elizabeth slipped away from the celebration, heading toward their home now truly theirs together in every way. Happy, Mrs. Keller? Forrest asked as they walked hand in hand under the star-filled sky. Elizabeth squeezed his hand. Happier than I ever dreamed possible, Mr. Keller, and you? Forrest stopped, turning to face her. The moonlight silvered her hair and illuminated her face, making her look almost ethereal. I spent most of my life feeling like I didn't belong anywhere, like there was always something missing. Now I know what it was. What? Elizabeth asked softly. You, Forrest said simply. It was always you. Even before I knew you existed, I was looking for you, for this. He gestured between them. For home. Elizabeth reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Welcome home, then, Forrest Keller. He lowered his head to kiss her there in the middle of the street where they had first met, where he had lifted her up, and without knowing it, claimed her as his own, just as she had claimed him. In the years that followed, Forrest and Elizabeth built the life they had dreamed of together. Forrest completed his medical training, officially becoming Elizabeth's partner in the practice. They expanded the office, adding more examination rooms to accommodate their growing number of patients. Their family grew as well. A year after their wedding, Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, after Elizabeth's mother. 2 years later, they welcomed a son, Samuel, named after Forrest's father, and 3 years after that, another daughter, Hope, completed their family. The town of Willow Creek grew and prospered around them. The railroad came through in 1880, bringing new people and opportunities. Elizabeth and Forrest were at the heart of the community, respected not just as doctors, but as the people who had helped bring peace to the once divided town. They never forgot their beginnings, how a chance encounter on a dusty street had changed both their lives forever. Sometimes, when they rode out together under the vast canopy of stars Forrest had once watched alone, they would talk about the strange workings of fate that had brought them together. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't fallen that day? Elizabeth asked one such night as they sat by a small campfire, their children sleeping in the wagon nearby. If you hadn't been there to help me, Forrest considered the question, watching the flames dance. I believe we would have found each other somehow, he said finally. Some things are just meant to be. Elizabeth leaned against him, her head on his shoulder just as it had been that night on the porch years ago. Like us. Like us, Forrest agreed, wrapping his arm around her. The lonely cowboy and the lady doctor. Not lonely anymore, Elizabeth murmured. Forrest looked at their children sleeping peacefully, then at the woman who had given him everything he'd never dared to hope for: love, family, purpose, home. No, he said softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. Not lonely anymore. And under the vast sky full of stars, surrounded by the family they had created together, Forrest and Elizabeth Keller were exactly where they were meant to be, in each other's arms, home at last.